Hi, my name is Melinda Calway, and today I'm going to be painting a scene for you from my backyard as I look out. And it's a lovely scene, and it's kind of an early spring or late spring, early summer morning. And this is the picture that I took out of my window yesterday morning. So I'm going to start off by painting the sky, and I'm going to do this with a wet and wet technique. I'm going to use a fairly large brush and just pretty much wet my whole paper. I'm going to put an underwash down first on everything, and then I'm going to start laying colors on. I will be pausing this video from time to time to do some drying because some of the techniques will be wet into dry. So I think I've got that fairly wet now. I'm going to use a 1-inch flat brush to lay my paint on. And I'm going to start off with the sky. And I've got some blue, and I put a bit of orange in it too, because I don't want it to be a really vibrant sky. I want it to have a mood, kind of a misty morning mood. So I've got my blue, and I put a little bit of orange with it, complementary color to bring it down a little bit. Okay, so this is going to be wet on wet there, and it will dry lighter. It's wet and wet. You can put it on back and forth if you want. You can put it on any which way. Doesn't matter too much, as long as you cover the area. So a little bit of a lighter blue in here. Mix it up a little bit. Bring that down. Now down here, I'm going to bring it down a little further, and then I'm going to put some other color on top of that. This will be the trees in the background. Putting in some yellowy color and just different colors that I see. The interesting part is everybody that does this will probably see different colors, and we all see things slightly differently, and that's what makes for very interesting paintings. If you ever get a little piece of anything on your paper, rather than removing it with your hand, move it with a brush. Okay. So in here, I want this to be a little softer. Right now, it's a little, it's not soft enough. So I'm going to take a specialized brush. It's called a blender, and it's a very soft watercolor brush in a fan shape. I'm just going to go back and forth like this a bit. Just want to blend that. It's a little more subtle there. Whenever I use this blender, I try and clean it right away and let it dry, because it works better when it's dry. There, it's softer. Okay, it's clean. And I'll put it back to dry. Okay, I've also got some greens mixed up, which I'm going to put down here. This is underpainting. I'm thinking this orangey color comes down just a little bit more. Bring that down a bit. And there's some orangey color down in here too, which I'll put in. Again, each individual artist has artistic license, so you can do this the way you see it or the way you want it to be. I'm going to let this, or I'm going to help it dry now with a hair dryer, so I'm going to pause it for a moment. Okay, so now I'm going to, this is dry, and that was a wet and wet technique. So I wet the paper first, and then I put the wet paint on it. So now it's dry again, so whatever I'm going to do now is be wet and dry technique. And at the back, there's a bunch of small branches, and they're kind of far away, so I'm going to use really thin paint. I'm going to put them in just kind of lightly. Also back here, there's a little bit of a yellow glow. So I want to put that in wet on dry. I'm using Arches 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. Which is my favorite paper to use. It's lovely. It's made out of 100% cotton, so there's really no paper in it. And it wets dry nicely. It holds the water, it holds the paint, and it's just lovely to use. These branches are just kind of in the background. Okay, so now I'm going to start painting in some of the green trees in the background. And some of it's green, some of it's kind of a yellowy color, so I'm going to start off. I'm using a number 4 round brush right now. This is an Escoda brush. It's made in Spain, and they're really well-made brushes, I think. I enjoy using them. This one is, it's a Kowinski Sable, which is a lovely brush. I got it as a gift. I did not purchase it myself. They are extremely expensive. One this size would probably, well, this one would probably be only about maybe $37 or something. And as they get bigger, they get to be like $237. So they're not inexpensive brushes, and they work quite well. But like any other brush, it loses its point after time, so you have to take really good care of it. The synthetic ones I find work really well too. I have several of those. So I'm painting in the trees as I see them. And there'll be a few trees. Now I really liked the feel of this morning. It had just rained and it was kind of a little bit hazy. So I'm trying to accomplish that feeling. I'm putting different kinds of greens in here. So I'm thinking about the shape of the tree. I want to get an interesting shape happening here. Whenever I have, like this will be sky here, I want this shape to be really interesting. So when people look at it, they say, oh, I love the shape of that tree. So trees do have very wonderful shapes. As I said earlier, I'm going to pause it every once in a while if I'm just doing something that's repetitive, so that this video won't be too long. So I'm putting in some darker colors now. Anytime you put a light color in, if you want to make it stand out, a dark color nearby will help it. And on the underside of the trees where the sun's not hitting, it's usually a little bit darker. Makes it look a little bit more real. I'll put a bit of a trunk in here, and there. I'm putting in this next tree here as well. I'm putting it in with the number 4 brush, and then I'm coming back with this smaller brush to get some little interesting points in here and shapes that I don't have a great point on that brush anymore. So this helps me to do the little niceties that I want to do on here. So what I put down up there is fairly wet still, so I'm just bringing a little bit of darker underneath it to showcase some spots. And at the very top of this, I think there's some pine cones up there, which kind of look to be a bit of a orangey red color. So I'm going to throw those in there as well while it's still wet. While it's still wet and you put color in there, it blends so nicely. It's what I call letting the water do the work for you. And that's great whenever possible to try and do that. So there's some pine cones down in here too, so throwing in that color. It's a bit of I'm using a burnt sienna or a quinacridone burnt orange, and it's a bit of a red color, so it looks nice next to the green. It makes the green stand out because of complementary colors. I have a tree on the side here that's kind of a bit of a yellowish color. I want to get that in now so that I have it established so I can know to paint around it. I don't want to lose that nice lighter colored tree. Using my number 4 brush again. You always have to keep in mind when you're doing a tree that it has to be thicker at the bottom and thinner as it goes up. If it gets too thin in spots on the way up, then it would just break off then. It doesn't look real. So if it gets too thick at the top, you have to make the bottom thicker. This branches off up here. Put some a little bit darker color in there while it's still wet. Not quite the color I was going for. It's a little more subtle. A little bit of variety here. I'll put some darker spots in afterwards when I put the branches in. It's important to make the branches go right off the page. If they go right off the picture, they should go right off the page. If you stop them all just before you hit the page, it starts looking a little bit like they're just floating there, and it's very contrived looking. So making them go off the page, it looks way better. And I've seen people that are quite afraid to make them go off the page. I'm going to put some little spots here and there while it's still wet. Again, it blends nicely this way and it's making the water do the work for you again. There's another tree in here that I'm going to put in now. Back to my number 4 brush to start. And because you've seen me put in trees again, they start off usually at the top with some small lines and they get bigger as I come down. I'm going to pause it again and come back shortly. So again, I'm using the slightly larger brush to get in the main shapes. I'm using an interesting color here that I don't normally use. It's called Nickel Titanium Yellow. And it's quite an opaque color. So for some of these lighter spots, I thought I'd try putting it in and see what happens. And because it's a bit opaque, it blends and mixes and separates and does some really interesting things on the paper. So I thought, let's give it a try. It's always neat to try different things and see what happens. And so far I'm liking what it's doing. It's, again, very opaque. I'm going to use some darker color now. I'm going to switch to my little tiny brush for a little bit, and I've got some perylene green here, really dark green. I just want to put it in some spots to punch this out a little bit. You can see the sudden contrast that's doing, and it's still wet up here, so it's kind of a soft transition. And I have a really nice blue that I want to put a little bit into. It's a bit of a teal blue, so I want to put that in. Okay, so switching back to my larger brush. Now I've got these light edges here, and I put those light edges in on purpose because I want to paint around them. I want to make them pop out by putting some darker greens behind them. So I'm using some of my perylene green. I'm using some ultramarine green, ultramarine blue, I'm sorry. And the blue that I was going to put a little bit in is this turquoise blue here. Again, just a little bit here and there. Just to add some interest. I'm trying to do it in the wet spot so it bleeds a little bit and spreads. But this is if you want to add some more colors and add interest. This is a good time to do it while it's wet. I sometimes do it when it's dry too. It's a little drier up here, but that's okay. Okay, so I've got my darker color here, so I'm going to bring some of this darker greens in and around. So what I'm doing now is negative painting. I'm painting around some of these boughs, limbs of the tree, branches, and trying to make it look interesting. So I'm putting in a little bit of this rusty color. It's a mixture of some different browns and ochre type things that I have on my palette. I'm putting that in here, and eventually I'm going to put some very light green over top of it. Okay, I painted this tree in here, and I put in some boughs that kind of come forward a little bit, and now I'm trying to paint around the edges of these to make them stand out a little bit more with some dark. So I'm doing some negative painting. I'm also wanting to do some negative painting around these lighter colored boughs that come out. Got some branches sticking out, so I want to paint around them to make them stand out a little bit. And again, this is called negative painting, and I'm painting wet on dry. So this paper that I'm painting on right now is dry. I'm putting in some ultramarine blue and some olive green, as well as some perylene green. So obviously this takes a little time. I'm not a fast painter. I would like to be, but I'm not. So I'm more of a detailed painter. And I have come to the conclusion that it is my style, so it's just the way it is. So it takes a little bit longer. And that's why I'm really glad I found this pause button, because it helps me show you things, but I can still pause it and then do a little bit more, so that you're not getting bored by watching the same thing over and over again. Okay, so I've got this part fitted together, kind of like a puzzle, all different parts, different colors. And on top of here and on top of here, there's some yellow color. And as we know in watercolor, it's very tricky to get a light color on top of a dark color. But if we know the different properties of our paint, then sometimes we can get that effect without too much effort. And I'm using Hansa yellow right now. And the Hansa yellow is fabulous in that it's very opaque. So sometimes it's not great to have opaque paint, but sometimes it works to our benefit. So knowing this, it will help me. So I'm going to just get a piece of paper and just spatter on the yellow where I want. I'm using a rigger brush to spatter because it spatters very nicely. It makes uneven spots and they look quite well. This is a little bit wet, so some of them are going to be soaking in, which I quite like. And I'll do some more when it's dry. And there's some of these spots down here too. So the Hansa yellow, that nickel titanium yellow also is quite opaque, so I can use a little bit of that too if I want. It's a little bit more of a white color. Titanium is white. As you know, there's titanium white, which is very opaque. There's titanium white and zinc white. I always remember that titanium white is stronger and more opaque. I think of the titanium like the Titanic because it's very strong. The Titanic, it wasn't strong enough obviously, but that's the way I remember it. And zinc is transparent as far as white goes. So the titanium in this yellow makes it quite opaque. So you can see those yellow spots. And again, I will put some more of those yellow spots in when this totally dries. But I'm just tapping my brush and I'm protecting up here because I don't want it to get too wet up there. So putting those in. And then I'm going to start adding some branches in here and there. So I've got two big branches here that come really close to the viewer. So they're nice and big and they're much darker than everything else. So I'm going to start off with a dark and then I'm going to make it even darker. I'm just using it's about a half-inch brush here, flat brush. So I use it as a mixing brush. It's got very long bristles. It wasn't a very expensive brush, but it's actually a very nice brush. Great for mixing and good for doing shapes where you need a flat brush. Okay, so I've got that on place, and while that dries up, I'm going to be putting some other branches in. There are a lot of branches that are coming from other trees that are further off, so I'm going to use my rigger. Love the rigger because you get very nice uneven shapes. And if you push down on it a little bit harder, you can get thicker shapes and thinner shapes if you lift off on it. So I'm going to be adding in a ton of these kind of branches. Now, if you have a shaky hand, you'll get very interesting branches. So don't worry if your hand is not steady. You can see I'm stopping and starting here, which again gives you that uneven, interesting, natural look. A neat trick I want to show you here is sometimes you want to get branches that are lighter on top of something darker. So I've got it's an acrylic brush with a very stiff bristle. So I'm just going to wet it a little bit and I'm going to decide, okay, I want one here. So I'm just going to bring that, it's still a little bit damp, and just bring that in. So I get this nice lighter branch on top of the darker branch. So I want to get some more texture on here. It's fairly dry, and I'm going to try scumbling some darker brown on there. So I'm going to take the brown that I used before, which was burnt umber, and I'm going to just drag the brush across a little bit to try and give some texture. I'm not going to worry about those lines that I lifted out before because I can lift them out again. So just to give this some rough look to it so it looks like it should be a branch. And there's two different branches here, so where they meet, I'm going to try and make it darker so you can see the difference there where one meets the other. So this is one technique. It's called a dry brush technique because your brush doesn't have a lot of wet paint on it. It's more dry, so that when you bring it across the paper, because the watercolor paper is rough, you're just hitting the surface parts of the paper, and just part of it is getting the color on it, and the other part staying dry and lighter. So that's one way of doing it. You can also just take a rigger brush, and you can just draw some lines on there. You can draw the lines where you want, make them interesting, make them look like it's rough bark on there. I like to add a few colors, so I'm adding a little bit of blue in here. I'm going to add a little bit of this. It's a violet color. This is cobalt violet. It's just very subtle. You won't even hardly notice them after, but it'll give it a little bit of more interest to the whole bark. There's some red. And you can play with it and do whatever you want. You have artistic license. And I'll do the other one the same. It's waiting for this to dry, so I'm going to bring this darker part right up here. And I'll take this brush again and I'll go back over where I lifted off before. I put some more spatter in here, and I will do some more. I've also noticed a little bit of spatter in there. There's a little bit of very light green leaves, so I'll put some of that in to add a little bit of interest. Again, just lifting these off while it's still wet. Make it look like there's lighter branches that come over top of the darker ones. Okay, so I put some small little buds here. This is a maple tree, and in the late spring it has these buds that end up falling on the ground all over the place, but they are quite attractive, so I thought I'd put those in here. There's a bit of green leaves just starting to happen in here. The yellow ones are, and down here there's yellow and green. So I've spattered these areas too, because spattering is a lot of fun, and you get these wonderful random looking spots. And I use the opaque yellow on top of there, and I'm going to probably do a little bit more touching up, maybe add a few branches down in here, just a few little things. Sometimes when you stand away and look at it, and I always squint my eyes too, I find that really helps back you away. You can see what little extra touches are needed. So and I often look at it the next day, and the next day I can see things that I didn't see while I was so involved in it and painting. So it's nice to do that. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to see other videos I've done, you can check out my YouTube channel by going to going to YouTube and typing in Melinda Calway. Also, you can check out my Facebook, which is Melinda Calway-artist, or my Instagram, which is melindacalway.artist, and my website is melindacalway.ca. So feel free to let me know if you enjoyed this, if it helped you. It always is good to know that if it helps you, because it inspires me to want to do more if I feel like I'm doing something that's useful to others. So have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed this. I kind of like the painting as it turned out. Thank you very much. Bye for now.